Okay, no, good.
Yeah, the Metropolitan and I, and the bishop shot over there Saturday morning before or after services in Reno on Friday. And then we decided to continue driving back. Or rather, they decided that I would continue driving.
Father Stephen still there?
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
the priest there.
Yeah, he's
Love
wonderful.
him.
Yeah. And Deacon Danilo is there too now. My Serbian brother.
That's right.
He's a character. They all. I've never met. I'm recording. I should be careful. I've never met a Serbian who wasn't a fun character of some sort or another. They're lively people.
Is his son,
Greek and
Oh.
Polish.
is he still?
Yeah, he's back. He's back in Boston. His wife is, I think, finishing her degree this May. And if I recall right, she's expecting and due the day after graduation.
Oh, wow.
God.
Wow.
Is the son becoming a priest?
Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah.
Yeah.
She'll graduate, they'll move back.
The kid that has long hair? Tall?
I don't know if he has that long hair. I haven't known him to have long hair, but
Yeah, he usually is pretty tall.
yeah.
Oh, he had a few kids, like 7.
All right, so we're going to talk tonight about the first and second epistles of St. Peter. And we'll give, so we're going through the general or universal or Catholic epistles. They have multiple different names. But fundamentally, these are the epistles that are not, like we talked about with James, that are not directed to any one particular person or church. Right? And we'll see that when we get into the first chapter of 1 Peter in just a moment. But to give a little bit of background, St. Peter was born in Bethsaida, next to the Lake of Tiberias, on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's interesting, Bethsaida in Hebrew or Aramaic actually means really the town of fishermen, or the house of fishermen, right? Which is a very appropriate thing given how many fishermen we know came out of that particular town. We know that his father's name was Jonah, right? He's called Simon Bar Jonah, right? Son of Jonah. And his given name was Simon. St. Andrew was his younger brother, and what's interesting is that Andreas, right, is a Greek name. It's not a Hebrew or Aramaic name. And that actually makes sense because that area of Galilee was known to be bilingual and to be a mixture of both Semitic and Greek people. And so it's not surprising that this very Jewish family would nevertheless have one son, Simon, which is a very Hebrew name, and one son, Andreas, which is a Greek name. Right? And it seems that his nickname, Kephas, which is Aramaic for, really means like Rocky, right? Rocky, like a nickname, pre-exists his confession of Christ. It was probably something that he was already called because we see it bouncing around and it's not like it changes things dramatically. But what Jesus does is that he uses that nickname, particularly from his Aramaic nickname, and then uses that to make a play on words in Greek between Petra and Petros, right? So it's not that he's exactly changing his name. This isn't as dramatic as some of the name changes we see elsewhere in Scripture, but it's more that he's taking a pre-existing term, which, by the way, if you've read the Scriptures, it's not surprising that this guy, Simon Bar-Jonah, probably had a reputation of being a little bit rocky, right? He's rocky, he's a little bit of a tough guy, a little bit brash, right? And so his friends called him Rocky. Christ uses that to make a play on words then in Matthew 16, which is where he starts to be called by the Greek version of that nickname, Petros, or Peter, right? And you can see here on the map, hopefully a little bit, right? You have Jerusalem down here in the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee is in the northern part. On the other side is Samaria. across the river from the 10 cities, Decapolis, right? And he's up in Galilee, near Capernaum and some of the other towns up there. Right? We see these other, we know Christ had this ministry, right, in Galilee, and we see all of these names that we recognize: Gennesaret, Cana, Nazareth, right, Tabor, Naim, and so on, right?
I need to make a comment though.
Yeah.
The last word, Petros, or
Yeah.
little rock, it's not little rock.
Mm.
Petros is rock.
Right.
Petraki is little rock.
Sure.
In
That's
particular,
fair.
Petraki.
Right.
Petros is straight, comes from the rock.
Fair enough.
Petra.
And what's really going on there is that he's changing genders, right? Between Petra, the rock of his confession of faith in Christ, on which the church is built, to him being Petros, rock as a name. Right? So we know that he's one of the three closest disciples to Christ, along with Saints James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And after Pentecost, we see him giving the very first apostolic sermon, which results in 3,000 people being brought to Christ that day, right? And I'm trying to remember now when we addressed this, or maybe we didn't, but it's interesting because this is happening on Pentecost, right? What is Pentecost in Second Temple Judaism? And if you read the Torah, right, Pentecost is just sort of a harvest festival 50 days after Pascha. But by the time you get to Second Temple Judaism, it's been transformed a little bit into something much more, which is the feast of the celebration of the giving of the law at Sinai, where the nation of Israel is constituted based on its covenant with God, right? It was quite literally the birthday of Israel. And then fast forward, you have the Feast of Pentecost. This is why, by the way, right, when you read the Torah, it's not a major feast day. It's not like Pascha or the Day of Atonement or some of these other big feasts in the Jewish calendar. And yet by the time you get to Acts, everybody's in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost, right? And it's because it's taken on this much greater significance. They've added to it, where it becomes the celebration of the giving of the law at Sinai and the birthday of Israel, the constitution of Israel as a nation, the people of God. And what happens after Christ's death and resurrection? This is the coming of the Holy Spirit, who writes the law in our hearts and constitutes the people of God as the church. Right? It's a continuation and the fulfillment of that first Pentecost, the giving of the law at Sinai, and the formation of God's people in Israel, now with the new covenant. And what happened after that covenant was ratified? 3,000 people were put to death by the Levites for having betrayed God. And what happens on the day of the new Pentecost? 3,000 souls are baptized. Right? There's a very deliberate paralleling that's going on there and fulfilling that's going on in Acts, that if you don't know Second Temple Judaism and what they're seeing going on with the Feast of Pentecost, you miss. It's an incredible parallel happening there, right? Using the exact same name. And that was Peter's preaching that day. We know that he's married. Christ healed his mother-in-law of a fever. Patriarch Bartholomew's favorite joke to ask people is, why did Peter deny Christ? It's because he healed his mother-in-law.
Whose joke is that?
Patriarch Bartholomew. Right. We also know that he baptized Cornelius, one of the first Gentile converts, right? And he's also the one who has the vision showing that the formerly non-kosher foods are now permissible for people to eat. According to both Origen and Eusebius, St. Peter founded the church in Antioch. He's believed to have stayed there as bishop as many as 7 years in Antioch. By the way, when Rome claims to be successor of Peter, Antioch was first. So why should the fact that Peter founded that church alone be the cause for that to now be the primo supreme above all church if Antioch was first? Just for one example, right? And Alexandria also traces its apostolic origins to St. Peter through his disciple St. Mark, who was ordained by him and sent there. To this day, there are actually many Christians in Antioch and Syria with the last name Simeon, which is Syriac Aramaic for Simeon. And many of them claim descent from St. Peter's family, claims that we can trace all the way back to the 1st century. So, which accords with the traditions that St. Peter traveled with his family to Antioch initially and lived there for some years. It's probably not surprising that some of the kids would hang out and stay there. And there are still people to this day that claim that background. After having first founded the church in Antioch, Peter went away to Rome preaching the gospel, and presiding over the church in Antioch, presided over that of Rome until his death, according to Eusebius, right? So he leaves Antioch, goes to Rome, and stays there until his eventual martyrdom. He and St. Paul are both together considered the founders of the church in Rome. St. Simeon Metaphrostes, the translator, relates that St. Peter's apostolic journeys took him to many parts of the Levant, Asia Minor, Spain, Carthage, Egypt, and maybe even Britain during the course of his various apostolic journeys. Eventually, we know that he returns to Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero. And the last straw for Nero was that St. Peter converted his 2 favorite concubines to Christ. And that's when he decides to put them to death. Right? St. Peter was crucified in AD 67. He says, "I am not worthy to be crucified as my Christ upright, for thus he was crucified so as to look to the earth where he would descend into Hades to deliver the souls therein. Crucify me head down, that I may look to heaven whither I will go." It's really beautiful, yeah.
I just have a question regarding, kind of related to the last slide. Is there a term pope that was just used in a smaller scale sense?
Yeah.
Okay, because a Catholic family member of mine was like, kind of we were having a discussion about
Yeah.
Catholicism and Orthodoxy. He's like, no, Orthodox never had any problem with popes until, blah, blah, blah. And I was trying to
We still have a pope.
yeah.
The Patriarch of Alexandria's title was Pope and Patriarch of Alexandria. Pope just means father.
Yeah.
Do you know in Serbia, I mentioned my Serbian friends, do you know how you say, one of the ways that you say father in Serbia when addressing a priest? Pope. There's a very common last name, like St. Justin Popovich. It means son of a priest,
Oh,
or son of a father.
So he's
right?
just, when a person uses this argument, it's a misunderstanding of how high that goes. Like the Catholic understanding would be that was like the head of the whole worldwide church, and ours was.
So you have to disambiguate, right? Because the word pope just means basically father.
Okay.
And at various times has been used to any number of priests and bishops, depending on where and when you're talking about. They say pope, and what they really mean is Bishop of Rome, and the Bishop of Rome's position. And there is no question that the Bishop of Rome had priority in the ancient church. And the canons bear this out of the various ecumenical councils. But why? It wasn't because St. Peter and Paul founded the church. Again, Paul founded a lot of churches, right? St. Peter founded other churches like Antioch and Alexandria, who claimed their apostolic origin through St. Peter. What made Rome the first was that it was the seat of the empire. It was the most important city. Right? Now, the fact that it had been sort of baptized in the blood of Saints Peter and Paul added to that, for sure. But that's not the reason fundamentally, which is why by the time you get to the Fourth Ecumenical Council, By this point in 451, Constantinople had become actually a more important city than Rome, imperially, or at least equally. Although by then you're already getting like a lot of the barbarian invasions of Rome and all of this going on. By the time you get to that Fourth Ecumenical Council in 451, they pass a canon saying Constantinople has equal rank as Rome. Okay, equal rank and prerogatives as Rome. Because Constantinople was known as New Rome, and what we today call Rome is called Old Rome. And Old and New Rome, by the time of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, are given equal rank. There's a lot more that can be said there, but yes, we respected Rome. Yes, we accepted that the Bishop of Rome was the successor of St. Peter, as was the Bishop of Antioch. We recognize that Rome presided, right, over the other bishops, although incidentally, Rome, generally the Pope in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, did not go to ecumenical councils, because who presided was actually the emperor, right? They claim now only the Pope of Rome can call an ecumenical council. Well, that's funny. Constantine called the first one, right? And he never bothered to show up. Understandably, it was hard. It was long travel. They were dealing with, after a while, barbarian invasions and all these other things. It's not surprising that he wouldn't come to an ecumenical council in the East. But that didn't stop them from having a council. They had he would send legates, in other words, like representatives to these councils, but they weren't given any kind of more authority than any of the other patriarchs that were there. And look, you can find the letters, for example, from St. Theodore the Studite during the iconoclastic controversies in the 800s, where he's writing to, this is the second wave of iconoclasm, he's actually writing to the Pope, basically saying, hey, bail us out of the heresy that's going on over here in Constantinople, and uses very lofty, flattering language to him in asking him to help. There are many times that Rome was a doctrinal bastion, right? When St. Maximus the Confessor we just celebrated, right? When we get to the Monothelite controversy, the heretical controversies that led to the Fifth and Sixth Ecumenical Councils, St. Maximus the Confessor couldn't find a bishop in the East who hadn't fallen into heresy at one point, and took refuge in Rome. And it was through that influence that eventually the East was restored to orthodoxy through the ecumenical councils. Not through papal fiat, through ecumenical councils. Not through the Pope telling them, ordering them, right? But rather through ecumenical councils that they eventually came back to their orthodoxy and got rid of their heresy. So anyway, that's all a long way of saying there's no question the Bishop of Rome has been incredibly important until he started thinking way too highly of himself. And if he were to become Orthodox again, we would very gladly recognize the prerogatives of old Rome. But that also doesn't mean that we accepted things like infallibility, which is a very late development. Papal supremacy, which was comes from Vatican I and Pastor Aeternus. I mean, they claimed it throughout, but they only defined it as their dogma in the 19th century, and there's no patristic support for that articulation of doctrine. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling. I'm sure I've given you way more than you asked for, but the point is, we respected and still respect the position of the Church of Rome. And if the Church of Rome were to return to orthodoxy, we would give it its priority and prerogatives.
Right.
But it is not the cornerstone of the church. I mean, this is one of the great heresies in the West. In Pastor Aeternus in Vatican I, they specifically say that Peter is the cornerstone of the church. Go back and read your New Testament. Multiple times, who is the cornerstone of the church? Christ. Right? St. Paul says it, St. Peter says it, we're going to see it, right? You are living stones and so on, right? Christ is the cornerstone of the church. For them to say that one of his apostles, and not even one of his apostles, but then the successor to that apostle down the line is now the cornerstone of the church, that's heresy. Full stop. Right? Anyway, I was just dialoguing with a former Catholic clergyman this morning on exactly these issues, but anyway.
So the Catholics now say that whoever is the successor, like the new Pope, is the cornerstone of the church?
That's what their ecumenical council of Vatican I in the 19th century declared as dogma, and that anyone who rejects that is a heretic and to be damned.
Anathematized.
Not even anathematized, damned. Right? I mean, that goes much further than even the language we use in any of the ecumenical councils before. Now, today, they will say, well, Vatican II sort of softened that. Well, then is it dogma? Is it dogma or not? Right? How do you soften dogma? That's the opposite of dogma. Right? Anyway.
Is he considered sinless
No.
in
No.
the Catholic Church?
Infallible when proclaiming matters of faith and morals means he can't err. It doesn't mean that he's sinless. You can, nobody can say that a pope is sinless. Read your medieval history books. Kyrie eleison. Yeah. Right. With all of their bastard children and all these other things. Anyway. Sorry, that was a little bit more of a tangent, but it is important because we are talking about St. Peter, right? And we know the popes can err. How do we know that? St. Paul had to call St. Peter on the carpet because St. Peter was making mistakes, right? There have been one or two popes who've been anathematized. They can't possibly be immune from error if they're heretics being anathematized. Anyway, there's a wonderful book by Abbé Goutet called The Papacy, written the 1900s. He was a Catholic monk who was tasked with defending the papacy against Orthodox claims. And it ended with him being ordained Father Vladimir by the Russian Orthodox Church. Anyway. All right. So, St. Peter and St. Paul are called the Koryphei of the apostles. This is basically the leaders of the chorus. And this was a name specifically from ancient Greek drama, where there were, at least prior to Sophocles, 12 members of the chorus in the plays. And there was always a chorus leader who led the chorus, right? And so there are 12 apostles, and St. Peter and St. Paul together were considered the chorus leaders.
Like singers?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an image, right? It's a metaphor. They're saying the chorus of the apostles, in other words, yeah. I'm sorry, Ray, were you?
No, I was pointing something out to Joanne.
Oh, okay.
The skull is kept at
St. John Lateran.
St. John.
Yeah. Right. Which interestingly, by the way, what is the Pope's cathedral in Rome? Where is his cathedra, his seat, his throne? Everybody says St. Peter's. It's not. St. John Lateran is the cathedral of Rome. St. Peter's is a major basilica in the Vatican, but St. John Lateran has priority as the cathedral in Rome, which is why they keep his skull there. Yeah.
Are his relics venerated?
Yeah, for sure. They progressively have found them. For a long time they didn't have them, and they've been doing excavations there in the kind of the 1800s up to the present, and they found eventually his tomb. St. Peter's was actually, in the Vatican, was built over ancient, basically pagan catacombs and sarcophagi. And they can see the catacomb. They raised a lot of them in building the Vatican, but underneath the substructure, there's still old, very old pagan catacombs. And specifically, though, under the main altar, they've been able to find his relics down there. What was his tomb? St. Peter's first epistle. He makes it clear he's writing from Rome, which he calls Babylon. Okay, which we still use that title, don't we, when we refer to sort of a dissolute, debaucherous, corrupt kind of place. We refer to it as a Babylon, right? He identifies himself, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion, the diaspora, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So this is a swath of churches throughout Asia Minor. Okay. Well, why those in particular? We know that the Emperor Claudius, between AD 42 and AD 54, created Roman colonies specifically in these areas of Asia Minor. And in AD 49, he expelled all the Jews from Rome, which resulted in many of those Roman Jews going to parts of Asia Minor. Remember, this is how St. Paul ends up meeting Aquila and Priscilla in Antioch, we talked about, right? And a number of other situations this is why St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, is writing to them, encouraging them to welcome back the Jewish Christians who had been previously dispersed. We talked about the fact that there had been sort of, in those years when the Jewish Christians were excluded, the Gentile Christians that were left in Rome had kind of carried on with their own thing. The Jewish Christians come back, and now there's tensions between the two groups, right? So it's that same historical situation leads to a lot of Roman Christians now being in this area of Asia Minor where Claudius had established these cities. So it's understandable then. He's probably writing in the late 50s or the early 60s, and because it's addressed to all of these churches, it's considered a more universal or general epistle. So he begins by giving thanks to God that they have been shown mercy by God and have become members of the church. He says, your purification will purify you and become your glory. But to that end, we must live holy lives worthy of our redemption, nourishing ourselves in the spiritual milk of Christ's teaching. Right? And he says, we are the spiritual stones, the living stones, making up the church with Christ as the cornerstone. These are some of the main highlights or points that he's trying to address, right, with these particular Christians. But then he has to deal with the issue of, so remember that in the ancient world, and throughout a lot of human history in a lot of parts of the world, very few people had agency, what we would call agency today, right? The ability to make decisions for themselves. Slavery in the ancient world was rampant and was a normal way, part of the economic system, right? In modern European and American history, slavery had a very, very major racial element to it. In the ancient world, it didn't necessarily. It was partially just how you dealt with debt. Right? If you couldn't pay your debts back, they didn't have bankruptcy, they had slavery. You became somebody's slave, right? Which, in some ways, I mean, British historian and economic theorist Hilaire Belloc would say we're basically there now. We're just slaves to corporations, right? We don't really have the means of production anymore. Our slave masters are not individuals, but rather corporate entities. Anyway, I'll fascinating book, The Servile State, is worth reading. Yeah.
Like in the Old Testament, there was a jubilee or something where every 7 years debts are forgiven.
Right.
Just kind of like on your credit report after 7 years.
Yeah.
But when did that specific type of jubilee end? I guess slaves were free or something. I don't know.
You know, if you actually read the Old Testament and the prophets, they never did it.
So So it was supposed to be done, but it wasn't?
They never followed the law,
Wow.
right? I mean, this is one of the things that the prophets keep coming back to, is that you don't free the slaves. You don't, feed the poor. You don't care for those who are less fortunate. You don't celebrate the Jubilees, right? I mean, that's the problem, is that God put that in place, and which was radical, right? For a world where basically everywhere slavery was just a normal part of the economic system, for there to be a place where the law says you have to free your slaves every short period of time, it was unthinkable, which is why they never did it.
Did they also not forgive the debts? Like, wasn't there something about forgiving debts under slavery?
Yeah. I mean, that's the point. That's why the prophets keep coming, right? And the kings, right? Read, First and Second Kings, and like throughout the whole history of Israel, God keeps coming back to, hey, I gave you this law, and you're not doing it. You're not following the covenant at all, right? Over and over and over, he keeps coming back to that. Yeah, exactly. That's the problem. So, St. Peter is writing this, and I would say, unfortunately, at particular parts in history, especially here in the United States in the 17 and 1800s, there were those who would use the fact that St. Peter, for example, doesn't condemn slavery, or like in St. Paul's letter to Philemon or whatever, he doesn't condemn slavery. And so they take that to mean, he approved of it, right? And that's not actually what's happening. First of all, St. Paul, in Philemon, he actually says, no, receive him as a brother, not as a slave, right? But more importantly, St. Peter probably could not have even conceived necessarily of an economic system that didn't include slavery, because it didn't exist in the ancient world. It's just how things happened. But rather what he's addressing is here, and this is the point of what he's talking about, what do you do when you're a Christian and don't have the agency to decide for yourself how you're going to live your life entirely consistent with Christ? And so that's why he talks first primarily to who? Slaves and wives, right? Slaves and women who didn't have agency for themselves in the ancient world. He says, submit to lawful authorities. He says, slaves and wives who live in homes where the patriarch of the household was an idolater, you're going to have an especially difficult time. Because it was just assumed, the pater familias, right? The patriarch of the family, you worshipped his gods, his idols were your idols, you did what he said. But St. Peter says, Christ has set all of us free. Right? Our freedom is found in him. So what do we do? What's our response to idolatrous rulers, whether governmental or household? We overcome them in the same way that Jesus did, by showing them love and mercy. We submit where appropriate, and we overcome them with love and with mercy. But then he addresses specifically Christian husbands who are a pater familias in some way or another, right? And he says, honor your wives and treat them as equal heirs of the grace of life, right? And this is where you can get twisted here, right? When St. Peter is talking to the wives in particular, he's especially addressing wives whose husbands are not Christian and who don't have the right, there was no right to I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and if you don't like it, then whatever, right? No. And so he's addressing here wives in those situations are how you can deal with things. But let me now talk to the Christian families. Husbands, they're equal co-heirs of the same grace of Christ, who has set them free. Right? And then he says, ultimately, honor everyone. Right? We win over those who disagree with us or oppress us with love and with mercy. But he's addressing two very different situations when he talks to husbands and wives in this passage. Does that make some sense?
generally wives who had husbands who were not believers, and then to the husbands who were believers, because the non-believers wouldn't be reading his stuff anyway.
Right. He's not addressing non-believing husbands. I mean, he's addressing wives generally, right?
Okay.
But if they're married to a Christian husband, then they should be treated as an equal heir of the grace of Christ. And so it's okay, it shouldn't be a problem for them in their freedom to be submitting to their husbands, because the husband is supposed to be honoring them, respecting them, and treating them as an equal, right? On the other hand, if her husband is not Christian, then, he's saying basically, your Christianity doesn't require you to sacrifice yourself and basically submit to being killed or homeless, because those are really the only options in the ancient world. Respect your husband, show him honor, but win him over with mercy and love. Right? Does that make some sense? It's too easy for people, once again, kind of like what we talked about with Ephesians and some of the other places, right? People start reading each other's mail. The husband starts reading the part about the woman and starts insisting on that rather than reading the part that applies to him, right? And in this part, in particular, in St. Peter's passage, this passage from 1 Peter, husbands only have business reading their section. It's the only part that applies to them, right? All right. He also mentions in chapter 3, right, Christ preached to the spirits in prison who were formerly disobedient in the days of Noah. And there's all sorts of incredible workarounds. Some of the reformers, for example, said, oh yeah, well, it was because Noah preached to them, and so it was Christ preaching through Noah. And I mean, there's all these kind of convoluted, twisted things that they try. And the people who were in prison were the people who were enslaved to their sins before the flood. And you get all these kinds of, all right. St. Athanasius says, this body it was that was laid in a grave when the word had left it, yet was not parted from it, to preach, as Peter says, also to the spirits in prison, right? Which is the hymn, it's one of the hymns from Holy Saturday and Pascha. The deacon actually says this prayer every time he senses the altar before the start of liturgy, at the end of the proscommunity. He says, in the grave bodily, but in Hades with thy soul is God, in paradise with the thief, and on the throne with the Father and the Spirit, was thou who fillest all things, O Christ the inexpressible. As an aside, what is the tomb in the church? It's not the Cuvucleum. It's the altar table. That's why the epitaphio, in the form of an antimension, is always on the altar. What does the priest say when he places the gifts on the altar at the end of the great entrance? The noble Joseph took down thy body, laid it in a new tomb, wrapped it in linen cloths, and anointed it with spices. As he wraps the ayir, the cloth, the veil, around the incense, the sweet spices, and then places it over the gifts on the altar. This is why my personal opinion is it is inappropriate to do the Divine Liturgy on Holy Saturday from the Cuvucleon, like we've sometimes done here in this church. That's a very late practice that developed in the church in only very specific places. The Cuvucleon is the funeral bier of Christ. It is not the grave. Which is why at the end of Lamentation service, what happens? The epitaphios is taken out of the Cuvucleon and placed on the altar and remains there until Ascension. And the Holy Saturday liturgy is supposed to be done on top of the epitaphium. And so what happens is that when you do the liturgy from the Cuvucleon on Holy Saturday morning, you're not serving liturgy on the epitaphios the way the canons dictate should be done from Holy Saturday through Ascension. Right? So, because we're mixing imagery there. The Cuvucleon is the funeral bier, the funeral processional bier of Christ, B-I-E-R. The altar is the grave, is the tomb. Right?
So today we can almost see more like the casket. We see the pallbearers carrying.
Yeah, Yeah,
Probably the
basically.
closest thing we have today.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, remember, see, this is part of it, and it's okay. The kuvuklion itself as a instrument is very late. You only find it in modern Greek and Arab parishes. Serbs, Romanians, Russians, they don't use it. They process with the epitaphios itself, the funeral shroud, because it is the icon of the body on it. They process just with that, which is what we also do in the Vespers of the Unnailing, right? We process it and then place it on the kuvuklion. In those churches, they simply have a stand placed there where the epitaphios is laid out, and then it's eventually taken up onto the altar as the tomb.
So the epitaphion, I don't know what he's talking about, these words, it's this big cloth,
Right.
it's large, and it has an embroidered icon, is what it is.
Right.
It's like we're seeing an icon of Christ,
Of Christ's body,
His body,
after taken
right?
down from the cross.
taken down from the cross. It's like an embodied version of what when we hear the part of the story about how Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus come and request, can we have the body? And they use their, status to expose themselves as believers and followers of Christ. They take the body so that it can be prepared for burial. And we have all this stuff about the myrrh-bearing women come to help. That's this piece of, pageantry comes in. It's like a big cloth icon. It's like a piece
So
of cloth.
the kuvuklion?
It's embroidered.
What's the
Well,
And
the
the
kuvuklion is the big
structure.
wooden structure, right? The one that you place the epitaphios into the
Laser.
kuvuklion, which is the wooden
Almost
thing
looks
that
like a
everybody
gazebo.
carries.
I thought they're all
What's that?
And we
I
put all the
thought
flowers
the
on.
opposite. I thought the epitaphion was
I
the
know,
wooden
the terminology
structure.
gets all confused, right? It gets misused in popular terminology. But the epitaphios, very clearly spelled out over and over again, is the shroud, is the cloth with the icon of Christ. And, by extension, they'll talk about processing the epitaphio as they're carrying the kuvuklion, right, which is the wooden structure. But the epitaphios itself is the right? Well, I mean, it's the thing that goes over the tomb, right? Right? Epitaphios, right? It's the burial shroud. It's a burial shroud, is what it's referring to. Not a wooden structure that you carry things in. And the wooden structure is a much later developed. It's okay. I'm not condemning these practices by any means, but it does start to confuse some of the imagery in the church, right? Because when the epitaphios is taken out of the kuvuklion and placed on the altar, and then liturgy is always celebrated on top of that, either in the form of the epitaphios during the Paschal season, or the antimension, the mini epitaphios, the rest of the time. It's because the altar always represents the tomb. Right? Always. Yeah.
Is it a practical reason to have the antimension open on top of the epitaphion, right? Because epitaphion kind of.
Yes.
Yeah.
And priests will still do that, and because the epitaphios doesn't bear the signature of the bishop, the antimension does.
Okay.
So yeah, practically they'll still use the antimension, and like our epitaphios is all bumpy and everything else. Pearls of the Eucharist would fall into it, you'd have a mess.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, my point in saying all of this is simply, we have to be careful about the imagery and remember that that the altar represents the tomb in the church, and otherwise the imagery of the services starts to get a little bit.
And I don't know whether it's typical for all churches, but in our church, the epitaphio throughout the year is on the wall as an icon.
Mm-hmm.
You can see it as you come in the church on the right hand side. If you see the wall on the right hand side, that's where it stands.
Right, and that's common, I think, in a lot of parishes. They kind of keep it in a safe place, displayed as an icon throughout the year. Yeah.
Sorry, more question. I've noticed there's some Greek words on the, I guess it's the altar, like where the communion is,
Mhm.
Is that The table of mercy or something, I think I saw it. I was
It's,
trying to figure it out, like,
Christos of
what does
the
it say?
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know, I'm
think
just
it's-
curious, I've been trying to figure out what it says.
I think it's taste and see how good the Lord is, but I don't remember
Okay,
actually off
okay.
the top of my
I
head.
thought I saw 4
Do you
words.
remember what the engraving is on the altar? Petrus?
It's like in front, there's like, I was like, oh, is that
Yeah.
love, and is that the, and I was like trying to figure out.
And the
what
problem
word.
is that many times we have a longer, the phrase is actually up on top and then continued on the bottom,
Oh,
and the
so I'm
cloth
just
tends to
part
block
of
the
Right,
top part.
because it's very weird how they have it said, we can see Christos
Yeah.
there with the Ita with,
Yeah.
not instead of the
Ότι
yoga.
Χριστός ο Κύριος, it ends, ότι
Right.
Χριστός ο Κύριος. And
Right.
Christos is not the name of Christ.
Exactly,
Right, right,
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Sarah, it's a good, I'll have to
I'm
go back
just
and look at
curious.
that, I don't
I'm
remember.
trying to figure it out.
Yeah, Father and I are actually talking about, I think somebody just donated some money for something in the altar, and I think we're looking at another white gold cloth that would not be so long in front, so that the inscription could be seen. I think Father's working on that. Okay, the other thing that St. Peter says, I know, isn't that he says, baptism which corresponds to this, meaning Noah's Ark, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers, having been subjected to him. St. Ambrose comments on this. God shows that the grace of the Spirit is turned away by carnal impurity and the pollution of grave sin, upon which God, willing to restore what was lacking, sent the flood and bade just Noah go up into the ark. And he, after having, as the flood was passing off, sent forth first a raven which did not return, sent forth a dove which is said to have returned with an olive twig. You see the water, you see the wood, you see the dove, and do you hesitate as to the mystery of baptism? So, this is a controversial phrase because there are a lot of Protestants who reject the notion that baptism is anything other than some sort of, ritual washing with no real effect, right? And St. Peter specifically says here, right, baptism now saves you. And again, they'll find all sorts of ways to sort of twist around and sort of suggest that it's saying something else. But I don't see how you can read this passage and not think that baptism is absolutely critical, right? I mean, what must I do to be saved? Repent and be baptized, right? You hear that like over and over in Acts and elsewhere. First thing is, if you want to be saved, be baptized.
And Jesus went to get baptized.
Right, now, well, his is a little different, right? This is the reverse of that, because he didn't need saving.
Right.
Right.
But he set the example.
But right, he sets the example, and he descends into the water to sanctify that water so that it can save us, right? Yeah. Anyway, this is me being, I guess this is my pugilistic day.
Well, I distinctly remember when Una was getting baptized, I met with a couple of the pastors, and they asked me what I hoped she would get out of baptism.
Oh.
And it was almost like it was just like an entrance into the church.
Yeah.
They didn't.
I can't even imagine. I don't know, Pastor, you tell me. Right. Well, I'd like to get from her what St. Peter says it offers, salvation. Right, it's sad. I mean, and it's weird because on the other hand, there's this push, like I've seen it with some of my cousins' churches, the baby dedications. We won't baptize them until they're later, but we're going to do dedications now because we don't know what to do. We want the baby to somehow sort of be involved in the church, so we'll do that, right? Which, by the way, is not that different than how our 40-day blessing kind of came around. But anyway, but they'll push baptism way off, but at the same time tell you you can be saved without baptism and it doesn't mean anything. Well, then why are you pushing it off? Why does it matter? right?
Because it's a personal thing, it's just like you're
Right.
self-declaring your Christian now. Just like
Right.
anything
But
else.
why does it need to be personal if it doesn't do anything?
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
It's like it's for other people.
Yeah.
It does feel like it's for other people.
right.
Which is a very weird thing, like then people who are like really processing deeply the whole notion that in the Protestant world that I'm from, like baptism is, or not baptism, but salvation in your Christian walk is extremely individual. It's like
Right.
a super privatized thing. It's me and Jesus, and we can even know what's really going on except me and him, and it's just us doing things together, and that's none of your business. Even if you're in my church and you're my pastor and you're anything, it's us, and we decide how this goes. So
Right.
then, if baptism is just like what it has
Public
become,
symbol.
is like it's a public display, then people reject that as like, I don't need a public display,
Right.
it's just
None of
me
your
and
business.
Jesus, nobody gets it. I understand that, it's like,
Yeah.
well, it doesn't really make any sense, you've turned it on its head. It's very bizarre.
Right.
I can understand, I can sympathize, even though it's like.
I mean, it's sad, right? And it's
very
sort of,
sad, yes.
it fundamentally, was the Ethiopian eunuch baptized
In front of people.
in front
to
of
show
people
them.
for their sake? No, it was him and St. Philip, that was it,
Right.
right? Why did it matter so much that that's the first thing, right? How do I follow Christ? Be baptized. We're going to just go to this little pond over here. We're going to do it right here, right now, right? Yeah.
He was a wonderful fisherman.
You have to
Right.
be a father to baptize.
I'm sorry?
You have to be a father to baptize.
So, not exactly.
So how do you want to take my kids to pond?
No. Only in the absence of a priest and under extreme circumstances. And then you're still expected to come to the church as soon as you see a priest to have all of the other parts of the service prayed and done. So, for example, you can't anoint them with chrism and give them the Holy Spirit. You can't give them Holy Communion. And remember, we talk about baptism as holy illumination, which is all three of those sacraments together. To give one without the others is to be incomplete, right? St. Philip, for example, baptized him and prayed for the Holy Spirit to come down upon him. And then probably gave him direction as soon as you can get to a church or get to a community, be there for the liturgy, for the Eucharist. And so we have to be careful, yes, so for example, in Soviet Union, there were plenty of grandmothers who baptized their grandchildren, because they couldn't go to the church without getting arrested, right? But even then, as soon as they would find an underground priest, they'd have him come and do the rest of the service, right? Here in the US at this point, it would be a pretty rare circumstance where it would be appropriate for that. Unless, in talking with the priest, he were to say, just go do it, right? Given that there are priests that you can have access to and talk to, anyway, does that make sense? Okay. But yes, I mean, for example, if you're in a hospital,
Yeah, that's the only time.
and it's in extremis, then you give birth to a baby that's about to die, and the priest can't get there in time, baptize it.
In the examples in the New Testament, kind of like what you mentioned with the Ethiopian eunuch and a lot of the other cases of baptism, it seems to be an immediate thing that happens right after the conversion. I'm curious as to how and why this sort of preparation process came about, the catechumenate and stuff like that.
Yeah, because of the experience that, so in those cases, it tends to be pretty remarkable, spontaneous moments that kind of lead to that. And you're being catechized by an apostle in the moment, right? What develops pretty quickly actually is a recognition that what becomes really hard for Christians is to live a Christian life. And that it takes a while for people coming from, especially paganism, to acquire a Christian way of life, way of living.
Sort of unlearn things.
Yeah, unlearning, right, developing the kind of new patterns and and so on. And to baptize them and expect them to just sort of figure that out overnight, you're sort of setting them up for failure, right? And so, especially as Christianity became less illegal, a little bit more comfy, a little easier to acquire, you weren't risking anything by becoming a Christian at some point. Excuse me, or risking a lot less. In those moments, or in those situations, there needed to be a period of catechesis, which was not theological instruction. Read the catechetical lectures, for example, of St. Cyril of Jerusalem. When is he teaching them the theology? After their baptism. Those lectures all occurred during Bright Week, after they'd been baptized Holy Saturday. So what was the catechism? The catechism was teaching you how to live as a Christian. How do you live virtuously? How do you pray? How do you fast? How do you avoid sin? How do you take yourself out of the sinful world in which you live? Then once you're living that life, and you're filled with the Holy Spirit, then you're much more able to understand the theological teaching that comes, right? This was the ancient model of catechism. And by the way, they were doing active exorcisms on folks for many months usually leading up, because these are people who have been demon worshippers many times. And they were even the Jews, right? Read the Gospels, right? You have all these possessed people running around. It's a dark time. And Christ had to call them out of all of that, right? And I don't know, my personal opinion is that we would be well served in the church. And I've talked to a lot of priests who, over the course of their experience, have kind of come to the same conclusion. It's far less important in catechism to make sure that everybody understands the theology. Yes, you need to give them that, and you need to help, especially because now they're coming in. One of the big things they're coming in with maybe isn't demon worship explicitly, but it's more all sorts of heretical notions about Christ that you kind of have to unwind. Nevertheless, where you see recidivism, where you see converts that come into the church and then leave after a time, most often it's because they never really started to adopt a Christian way of life, an Orthodox way of life, before being received into the church. And they had perfect example, go on Orthodox Twitter these days, right? You can find all sorts of people claiming to be Orthodox, claiming to have all sorts of knowledge, and people debating on Twitch and whatever other live stream programs and platforms they're using, who claim to be these great Orthodox apologists and know all sorts of things, and they can rattle off father after father and all these things. They haven't been to liturgy in 6 months, or ever, right? Declare themselves Twitter catechumens and don't even have a church community that they're connected with, right? It has nothing to do with what you know at that point, and everything to do with how you're living. Metropolitan Orthos Lachos actually has a wonderful book called Entering the Orthodox Church, where he kind of addresses what was the historical concept of catechism and how might we be applying that today. I do think that it's an important thing. And I know priests who, for good reason, based on experience, now will insist on a period of exorcism and reading the catechumen prayers before a person is received, which was the ancient practice, not one and done. Anyway, sorry, does that answer that? You know, I think it's something that we still haven't quite figured out in the US as we're seeing this new influx of people, is what is the appropriate way to be catechizing them? Because you can fill them with all sorts of knowledge about ecumenical councils, and then, you know, the first major moral dilemma hits them and they don't even know how to respond or what to do. Right? Or they go to a family reunion or, you know, high school reunion and see a bunch of their old buddies and don't have the strength to respond to that in a Christian way because they're not really living a Christian life in real practical terms. Right? Yeah.
Like, I'm thinking about, you know, living a Christian life, and then, like, on the fast days, I have a problem where sometimes I just overeat with the mostly fast-worthy food, and it defeats the whole purpose. And I have a hard time with that, and I'm trying to overcome that, and I'm like, do I just stop and pray? I mean, I'm having, that's been very hard for me, like, because especially like with work, and then I'm working, some days I work like these 2 jobs, and then I'm just stressed out, and I'm like, you know, that's just something I'm admitting that I've had a really hard time with. I wanna do well, and I wanna like do the fasting and let it bless me, and I'm like messing it up.
All those carbs in Lent, there are people who end up gaining weight rather than losing it because they're eating all the bread, the pastas, and everything.
Yeah.
Well, but you know, I mean, what you're also pointing out though is that you're right. It's, you know, the devil's crafty, and we have to be craftier, right? And as soon as you start trying to address one area, he'll sort of say, "Oh, well, let me come in over here," right? And it can be very easy sometimes when we start. I mean, on the one hand, why do we have these external practices of asceticism? Because if I can't control what I do with my body, how am I going to control what I do with my mind and my heart? Right? Right. If I can't shut my mouth, how am I ever going to learn not to think the thoughts of the things that I want to say?
Yeah.
Right?
Because we know that the flesh is
Right.
more than anything else.
Absolutely. And you know, look, I think when it comes to the flesh in all of its various sinful forms, I think it's the low-hanging fruit for the evil one. I think it's why we tend to be so focused on it. I think you talk to any spiritual father and he'll tell you that most people are a complete mess when it comes to those things, in some way or another. And I think as a result of that, God is likely to have the most mercy when it comes to those things, if we are genuinely trying to address the bigger root issues. It's not to say that we ignore these things. Right? It's not to say that we ignore them, or that we just sort of say, okay, well, whatever, I can indulge. That's not to say any of that. But I also think that we're all pretty messy. And that is the low-hanging fruit for the devil to attack us. And so in one sense, it's where we start in a lot of ways. But we need to not be so hyper-focused on those things that we forget the deeper issues. Pride, envy, greed, right? Hatred, anger, these things. In fact, a lot of times, that's what fuels the sins of the flesh. If you read St. John of the Ladder or St. John Cashin and so on, right? Anger, for example, envy, desire to control others, and that kind of pride tends to come out as sins of the flesh. Now, that means that it can be really hard to address those deeper issues if you're continually sinning and indulging with the flesh, right? Whether it's gluttony or lust or any of these other, the drink or whatever. But it also means that if that's all you're focusing on, and not looking at those deeper sins that kind of undergird all of those things, you're never going to make any progress, really. It's why, I think it's so important when we really are examining ourselves, when we're preparing for confession and so on. Start with the Beatitudes. Right? Start with the Beatitudes. If you address the Beatitudes, you'll address the Ten Commandments, right? But you're addressing the higher and the deeper issues. Yeah.
What means beatitude?
Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Right? Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the merciful. These things. Folks, start there. And all those other things will kind of fall into place. But I think they also get put into perspective in the broader scheme. I heard Archbishop Pilaforos actually in a talk he was giving in February of 2023 to a small group of us in Arizona. He made this point. He said, we all get so hyper-fixated, for example, on sins of the flesh. He said, I don't know, when I read Genesis, I see pride at the root of it all, right? And unfortunately, people took that out of context and basically said, oh yeah, see, he's a libertine. He said you can do what you want. That wasn't his point at all. What he was saying was, go deeper, right? Go further and look at the things that really count. That then, isn't most of the acting out of lust really, doesn't that have as its core selfishness, right? And if you're a selfish person, in a lot of, you're never going to be only selfish when it comes to lust. Right? If you're a selfish person there's a lot of other selfishness playing out in your life, without question, right? So, maybe the flesh at that point is weak. So address the selfishness in a lot of other areas too. Chip away at its foundation, right? While you're working on some of these other areas as well. But get at the core, get at the foundation, right? Anyway, does this all make some sense? St. John Cassian is a master when it comes to these things. Likewise, St. John Clinico, St. John of the Ladder. They have both of them have a lot to say in this regard. St. Theophan the Recluse in his Path to Salvation talks about it a fair bit. Anyway, St. Peter then says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Resist him firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. Right? First of all, you're never alone. Right? But be humble and watchful. And I love this quote from Tito Colliander in The Way of the Ascetics on this point. Whoever engages in inner warfare needs at every moment four things: humility, the greatest vigilance, the will to resist, and prayer. Isn't that a summary of what St. Peter just said? Right? It is a matter of dominating with God's help the Ethiopians of thought, thrusting them out by the door of the heart, and crushing at once those who dash your little ones against the rock. From Psalm 136:37. Humility is a prerequisite, for the proud man is once and for all shut out. Vigilance is necessary in order immediately to recognize the enemies and to keep the heart free from vice. The will to resist must be established at the very instant the enemy is recognized. But since without me ye can do nothing, prayer is the basis on which the whole battle depends. Isn't that beautiful? If you haven't read The Way of the Ascetics by Tito Colliander, you are missing out. He was a Finnish Orthodox layman and theologian in the 20th century, and his little book, The Way of the Ascetics, is just an absolute classic, easy to read, but has the whole heart of spiritual warfare there.
I think it's
All
in
right.
the library.
Awesome. There you go. See, it's in the library.
Found it.
Perfect plug. Perfect plug.
I have
In
another
fact,
copy too.
see, there you go. And look, you're coming up on Lent, right? Lent's not that far away. It's a short little book, and it packs a punch. If you haven't picked out your Lenten reading and you haven't read this book before, please, it has my full endorsement. Read it. It's really, truly excellent. In fact, St. Nicholas Osier Parish in San Anselmo has matins usually every morning during the first week of Lent, and they read the whole book during the matin services for people. And they pause in a few different places, and the presbytera there will read it. It's magnificent. It's where I first heard it. Okay, second epistle of Peter. Anyone other questions on first epistle? Second epistle is a little shorter. All right. So what's interesting about 2 Peter is that it's actually hard to find any fathers that mention the letter as having been written by St. Peter. It's one of the last books recognized in the canon. And what's interesting is that the Greek in 1st and 2nd Peter is very different. Very different, right? Not just at the level of different scribes, like with St. Paul different, but like totally different vocabulary, etc. Okay? What's also interesting is that most of the epistle of St. Jude, which we'll talk about maybe next time, is actually restated in chapter 2 of 2 Peter. This is something I've never really paid attention to, and it was a point somebody made, and I started looking, and it's true. Most of the epistle of St. Jude, which is really just a long paragraph, is actually in 2 Peter chapter 2. All right? The language, though, is very similar to the epistle of St. Clement, which is a late 1st century epistle out of Rome, and the Apocalypse of Peter, which is an apocryphal work around sometime before AD 140, so early 2nd century, also written in Rome. It's using language that we see from Greek-speaking Christians in Rome. Right? So the suggestion that you'll find by some folks is that this is probably an epistle. So if you go to Protestant scholars for the most part now, they're just like, we don't know who wrote it. It wasn't St. Peter. It probably wasn't even written until the late 2nd century. That's bogus. But what's probably going on here is that this is written by one of St. Peter's disciples in Rome, based on his teachings, and it's probably around AD 80, okay, the year 80. Similar to what St. Mark did with his gospel, right? What is St. Mark purporting to do in his gospel is record what St. Peter told him about his experiences with Christ, right? Because St. Mark wasn't an eyewitness to most of that the way St. Peter was. He records what St. Peter tells him, right? And St. Mark's gospel could really be called St. Peter's gospel in a lot of ways, right? And so what's happening probably with this epistle is the same thing. And what probably happens here is that either St. Peter preached a homily at one point about the epistle of Jude, or this disciple of St. Peter had a copy of St. Jude and is sort of weaving that into the teaching that he heard from St. Peter, right? It's a little hard to say either way. That doesn't change its canonicity or its apostolicity, or whatever word that would be, the apostolic nature of the letter. But it does sort of explain why you're dealing with a pretty different vocabulary and syntax and so on from the first epistle, that in most of the fathers, 1 Peter is referred to simply as the epistle of Peter. Right? They don't call it the first epistle of Peter, it's just the epistle of Peter.
What do they call this?
Most of them don't comment on it at all, initially, at least in the early fathers, right? And so that sort of suggests this probably comes out of Rome with his disciples as a sort of recapitulation of his preaching and teaching. Does that make sense? So it's not wrong to call it from St. Peter, but it wasn't from like his hand or something like that, right? Which is not the criterion. St. Paul didn't pick up a pen and write most of his epistles. He dictated them, right? And just because something is written by an apostle, I think Father Stephen DeYoung at one point gives the example, we were to find one day St. Peter's shopping list. That would not make it scripture, just because it was written by him, right? Anyway, does that all kind of make some sense?
As far as scripting, at the end of the first letter,
Right.
It does say that through Siluan,
Right.
I'm writing this small letter. Small is like
Yeah,
10
right.
pages.
Right.
And then also refers to Mark.
Right.
Right? As,
Exactly.
as my son.
Right.
Mark
Right.
went to Rome.
Right.
And that,
Right. He traveled with St. Paul, and then eventually he goes to Peter. And yeah, exactly. Right. And there are other places where St. Paul refers to his letter as being from Paul and Timothy. Paul and Timothy together wrote the epistle, right? Which is why in various epistles of St. Paul, the language and syntax sometimes changes a little bit. These are different scribes, different, multiple people sometimes writing it. And that was a normal thing in the ancient world. Very few people actually wrote their own stuff, right?
and I wonder if Peter could speak Greek, or was it?
We know he could speak Greek, right? Because like we talked about, he came from a bilingual portion of Galilee, right? His brother is a Greek name. And the first epistle, everybody attributes to him. Probably through a scribe. He probably didn't write it himself, but through a scribe. But this is not so similar enough to be explained by just a different scribe. There's all sorts of unique vocabulary that doesn't show up elsewhere. Like Tartarus, a very kind of Greek-speaking Roman thing for him to mention. So there's some blending. There's another voice in here that we're getting with St. Peter's, right? Anyway, but it doesn't change anything because the church has affirmed over and over and over again, this is the inspired scripture from the teaching of St. Peter, right? So he says, prove your faith with works of virtue, faith, goodness, knowledge, self-control, endurance, godliness, mutual affection, and love. Accept the teaching and admonitions of your leaders, the bishops and presbyters. But be aware of false teachers and false prophets, especially those who try to shake our faith. And these are some of the major points that he's making out, right? Prove your faith with works of virtue like Abraham did, right? Which we talked about with St. Paul in Romans. It wasn't enough for Abraham to believe God. He had to actually go do it before he was justified, right? St. Peter also, this is how we know that this is originally coming from St. Peter from some form or another, because he talks about the transfiguration in the first person. Right? This is the reading that we reread on August 6th, the Feast of the Transfiguration. For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received from God the Father honor and glory when such a voice came to him from the excellent glory. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And we heard this voice, which came from heaven, when we were with him on the holy mountain. And so we have the prophetic word confirmed, which you do well to heed as a light that shines in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. Right? Such a beautiful passage, right? We are transfigured, right? That light of the transfiguration illumines us. This is what St. Gregory Palamas is talking about when we see in the lives of so many saints like St. Seraphim of Syria, right? But yeah, this first person testimony makes it clear this is coming from St. Peter, even if it wasn't written exactly in his voice and hand. And God is not late. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. Right? He's not late, he's not delaying. There's a beautiful story about a monk one day who was in the forest, and he's praying and he's listening to the chirping and the singing of all the birds. And he begins to pray, Lord, what does it mean for 1 day to be as 1,000 years in heaven? And as he's standing there listening to the singing of the birds and praying, he feels like he spends the entire day there. And he finally kind of wakes up a little bit, comes to the birds have finally started to die down, and he walks back to the monastery and he finds that 1,000 years have passed. Now, I don't know I don't know a name. I don't know that this is necessarily true, right? In a factual kind of way, it was this monastery with this monk. But certainly many of the saints have described similar circumstances where in prayer time kind of just dissolves for them. And they will sometimes pray for days at a time and not even realize that any time was past.
Helps me, it's fun to think about C.S. Lewis' children's series of Narnia and the way that he chose to portray time, that they go into this world and they can have whole careers and lives and adventures and come back and people go, what are you talking about? You were just in the other room.
Right.
This feeling of
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've all probably caught some glimpses of that at some point, right? We've all had those moments in our life of peacefulness, of joy, of prayer, where things blend away, right? We've been in vigils where sort of you have no anchoring anymore of what time of day or night we're even in anymore. We don't remember exactly how long we've been there. We don't know exactly how much longer we have, and you're just sort of present, right? So he's not late. I've repeated before, I think, a homily I heard a while back, I think Carlene was there, from Father Ninos, where, he points out we so often are so caught up with thinking that it's the end times, right? That the checklist has all been checked, right? Johnny Cash, right? Anyway. And this is it, right? And Father Ninos preached a homily a couple years ago where he said, what if we've only just started? What if we've only just begun? Right? What if we have still many millennia left before Christ returns for the church to continue doing its work and growing? What if the church is still in basically its infancy? How would you react to the world around you in proclaiming your faith then? We get so caught up in thinking like any minute now. Well, I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe, right? And obviously, we know the understanding memento mori, right? I could get hit by a car on the way home, and that's it for me. And we live every day as if it's our last day, every hour as if it's our last hour, prepared to stand before the throne of Christ. And at the same time, maybe as a church, we haven't even started to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And frankly, it's probably pretty accurate. I don't know, you look around the world, and what I see is a world that the church still has yet to make enough of an impact in. So, rather than being fatalist and throwing our hands up and suggesting somehow that like, well, Christ is going to come, it's all, just going to hell in a handbasket, and so just why bother? I'm going to focus on me and Jesus again, like Carlene was saying, right? Maybe we as a church have a lot of work to do and we should get on it. Right? And maybe the reason that the world around us doesn't look like the church has had too much of an impact on it is because I and too many others have thrown up our hands and already given up on it. That's the end for tonight. Any questions or thoughts before we wrap up?
Heart seeking but do not overlook this one fact, that preceding that is, the people talk about when's it's coming that you're talking about, right?
Right. And he's basically saying, hey, days is 1,000 years, 1,000 years is one day. Don't get hung up on that. You're here. Do the work of the gospel. Don't think that he's somehow delayed and not doing what he's supposed to do, or being neglectful. Rather, you don't be neglectful. Get on it. Any other questions or thoughts? They're meaty epistles for being so short. There's a lot there, right? He really does pack in so much into these two epistles. Yeah.
Was Saint Peter in Rome at the same time as Saint Paul was in Rome too?
Yeah, they definitely overlapped for long. Yeah.
We don't know anything about Peter's wife. It's interesting that we don't.
Yeah, and you have to wonder if maybe his family stayed in Antioch, right?
That's a good question.
Since there are these people who claim descent from him, and he goes on from there to a lot of other places, right? Spain and Rome and so on. Yeah, you kind of have to wonder if maybe she, sort of like St. Joseph, just sort of disappears from the gospel narrative. I don't know, and maybe there's a source out there that will correct me, but my suspicion is that she's with him in Antioch, and at some point, dies of natural causes, and he continues with his journeys.
I had read something somewhere about the theory that she was martyred with him. I don't remember.
I mean, that could be.
Yeah.
You don't think they have children?
Well, I think they probably did,
Probably, if
because
they're
there are
descendants.
people claiming descent from him in Syria and Antioch, so he probably did. Maybe she did. I haven't seen that in any of the martyrologies I've read, but yeah, it could be.
And it would be surprising her name would not be remembered if she was martyred too.
Yeah, usually when husbands and wives are martyred together, we remember them.
Especially an apostle. It
Yeah,
seems unlikely.
right.
Yeah.
But
Huh,
I don't know. That is it's an interesting point. I haven't really thought about it, but you're right.
Was Paul married?
Paul was not. No, Paul was not. Yeah, he even uses himself as an example of celibacy at one point, right? I wish that you would all be like me, but if you can't be, better to marry than to burn, right? I think those are two separate passages I'm conflating, but it's kind of the point. Anyway, right? No, St. Paul was not. St. John the Evangelist was not married. We know some of the others were. I'm sorry?
St. Philip was married.
St. Philip. Well, that's St. Philip the deacon, not St. Philip of the 12.
You're right.
But still,
Also,
yeah.
he was married, but he's not
Right,
the 12.
right. Simon the Zealot was married. I think it's his wedding that is the wedding at Cana. Anyway, so some married, some not. And, which actually kind of is consistent with what we see in the early church, which is that there were married bishops. There was always a preference for unmarried bishops because of the pastoral demands, but they did have married bishops. And then over time, they eventually kind of move into, by the Sixth Ecumenical Council, Fifth, Sixth Ecumenical Council, the Canonical Council of Trullo, you start to see, it being legislated that bishops should not be married. That's really not until the 7th century. And even then, there seems to be some evidence that it wasn't universally enforced right away.
If a priest was married and his wife died, could that priest eventually become potentially?
Absolutely. So Bishop Spiridon, who the former Father Spencer Kezios from Northridge, is retired, but he's a bishop. His wife died some years back, and something like a little over 4 years ago, he was consecrated a bishop. Not long ago, reposed was Metropolitan Elia Khatri of the Albanian Church here in the U.S. He lived in Las Vegas. Same thing, he was a widower when his wife died. Bishop John of Worcester, of the Antiochian Church, is a widower. And actually, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, Metropolitan Nicholas, is a widower. He and his wife were very young. I think he had just been ordained a deacon, and his wife was killed in either a car accident, was it a car accident or cancer? I don't remember now. But very tragically and kind of unexpectedly, she died, and he was given a choice to be laicized or continue, and he continued. Now he's actually the metropolitan of the entire ROCOR. I know one widowed priest who refuses to allow himself to be made an archimandrite, so that he doesn't get put on the list of eligibles to be made a bishop. Archimandrite is an honorary title for celibate monastic bishops, monastic priests rather, and so in our archdiocese at least, the only ones eligible to be made bishops generally are those who have the title of archimandrite. So this priest is not letting that happen so that he can't.
I thought I heard somewhere that like if a bishop is married but then his wife moves to a monastery and they sort of, then, I mean, I guess I said it wrong. If someone
No, you're
maybe
right.
becomes a bishop or something?
No, you're right. If there's a priest whose wife
Or a priest.
agrees to move to a monastery, he can be made a bishop. This is from that Council of Trullo I was talking about, the Quinisext Council. The first time I ever served with the Metropolitan, he slipped in commemorating me and commemorated me as the Hierodeacon Justin. That means the monk deacon Justin. My wife came up for Antileron at the end and she said, "What are you doing with me?" And then she came to me and I like started to comment on it and she said, "You don't get out that easy." Anyway.
I know long ago when I was still in Greece, you reminded me of the wife that went to the monastery. There was this couple that was sort of related to my sister's husband or something, and they were married. They wanted to have children. They tried 4 or 5 years. They couldn't have children, so they decided to each to move out in a monastery and live monastic lives.
There's a lot of precedent for that in the church. The parents of St. Sergius of Radonezh both became monastics. Certainly other examples of that, plenty of them in the life of the church. So, it has to be done carefully and done truly as part of a vocation. But yes.
I was curious, so if they're both a couple, they're both alive, they don't have to agree,
They do.
both of them, that, like if the wife wants to go. And does their husband have to agree with that, or?
He has to agree to his wife doing that usually, yes.
He
because
has to agree, and
yeah.
if he doesn't,
then the bishop says you're not called to be a nun.
okay. Because I guess the obligation is from the one to other, husband and wife, to respect each other and to.
Right.
honor them
And so it has to be done by mutual consent. You
Okay.
don't break up the
That's what
marriage, unilaterally like that. And it can be difficult. I mean, St. Maria Skopsova is a modern example of that. She and her husband, their relationship was very difficult. It was already very rocky. and she asked to go become a nun. And he had a hard time with that initially, and it took him a little while to give his consent. And eventually he did give his consent, and she did become a nun and eventually a martyr and a saint. But it was hard on him, and the Metropolitan of Logi, I think his name was, of Logos, respected that and didn't push, and wouldn't accept her as a nun until the husband had agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you don't do violence to one sacrament
Right.
for the sake of another, right?
That's why I asked, because
Yeah.
it's just,
By the way, monasticism is a sacrament. Don't get hung up on that 7 number that the Catholics cram down our throat. The blessing of waters is a sacrament. We're not limited to 7. Anyway, and the funeral is a sacrament. Finally. Anyway, any other questions or thoughts?
Thank you
Gone
for the
all over the place, of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Through the prayers of Holy Father, so Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen.